Hey guys, and welcome to your lecture on adolescence. Adolescence is considered the time period between childhood and adulthood. It's a transitional period. It used to be in the 1890s a 7.2-year interval and has increased by roughly about 5 years. There are reasons for this increase in the period of adolescence on both ends. Menarche, or the time at which women get their period, is starting earlier. That's often an indication of better nutrition. And then the idea of independence has gone later in life now because of things like education and careers. So the definition for adolescence, the transitional period from childhood to adulthood. The problem with this period is you're not truly a child anymore, but you're not quite an adult. Puberty is going to be one of the major milestones during this time period, and that's when you become capable of reproduction. It's a period of sexual maturation. Know the difference between your primary and your secondary sex characteristics. Primary are going to be what make you able to reproduce, while secondary are usually going to be the things that we distinguish male from female. Menarche is going to be your first period. Please take time to pause the video and look over any of the additional information on this slide. For the most part, throughout adolescence, boys and girls tend to be close in height and size. And it's going to be right around puberty, with girls starting puberty slightly earlier than boys, where girls will have a small or brief surge ahead, probably being just a little bit taller around the ages of 12, 13, 14. But by about age 14, boys will again become taller. This is just another slide for you guys to be able to place the primary and secondary sex characteristics and things that change as you enter puberty. Looking at brain development during adolescence. If we were in class, we would hopefully have had a chance to watch the video. The video talks about how your brain is changing during this time period. The adolescent brain is not a fully mature brain. In fact, when we start looking at this, there's going to be a time period of what we call selective pruning. In other words, your brain is going to start to remove any of the pathways that have not been utilized in a long time in an attempt to make the brain more efficient. Your prefrontal cortex is going to be the last part of the brain to mature. Now, all the bulk is there, but what you don't have is the myelin sheath that's going to surround those neurons that are going to speed up neural transmission. So because of this, your fully developed limbic system isn't always completely held in check by your prefrontal cortex. So the immaturity of the prefrontal cortex may actually explain why risk-taking behavior increases during adolescence. Fully developed limbic system, pleasure center, your hypothalamus, hippocampus, and amygdala, they may actually get your impulses going before your brain can really kind of sort through them and decide what is the most appropriate behavior. Here's your prefrontal cortex, or your frontal cortex, and again, like I just told you in the previous, the frontal cortex is going to be in the process of growing myelin sheath. That should speed up nerve conduction because that is the fatty tissue that surrounds the axon. Hormonal surges in the limbic system may explain the occasional teen impulsiveness because they go unchecked from the frontal cortex because it isn't ready to really kind of process and filter through that information as quickly as it should. Cognitive development in adolescence, we're going back to Piaget for this. Hypothetical thought becomes apparent. You begin to think about how you think, you begin to question what others think, and you start to concern yourself with what others think about you. This is when students and really adolescents become idealistic. They criticize society, parents, they criticize themselves. They can start to see possibilities that didn't exist before, and this is actually a very good thing. It allows you to kind of formulate and decide what you believe and what you think. Again, I told you this is really kind of Piaget when we're talking about cognitive development. So again, you can form that hypothetical abstract thought. When talking about formal operational thought and the ability to use abstract concepts, the ability to get to this stage and to actually start to use the abstract and the hypothetical, it doesn't happen at the same time for everyone. Some people would argue there are individuals in a society that never reach this stage, and others may reach it later into adulthood or early adulthood. This task established by Piaget is meant to challenge the thinking of someone that should be in hypothetical or abstract thought. And what it requires is the person to know how to write an algebraic equation that would make it hold true. So make the weight times the distance equal on both sides of the center. So obviously that would mean that a lighter weight would have to be further away, a heavier weight would have to be closer. And so a 14-year-old should be able to set up the problem and understand it, where a 10-year-old might be close, a 7-year-old is not going to be able to understand it, and a 4-year-old is just way off. And again, it requires that kind of ability to set up an abstract or really kind of a hypothetical equation, which is what you see in algebra. Kohlberg is where we get to moral thinking, or really what he called moral reasoning. It is important to understand he talked about moral reasoning, not moral action. So what you think is the right thing to do, not whether or not you would in fact go through with it. And he uses this by looking at the Heinz dilemma. I would strongly encourage you to look up on Google the Heinz dilemma by Kohlberg. There's plenty of videos out there that'll run you through how he kind of looked at that. His moral theory had 3 levels, and each level had 2 stages to it. Pre-moral level, child has no sense of morality as adults understand it, and so he was only interested in when children became moral thinkers. Child's moral view is based on what others think until the highest level of development creates independent thinking. Again, if you have a chance, try and find a video or click on this one if it works to view the Heinz dilemma. For Kohlberg, you really need to know the 3 major categories. Knowing the subcategories is great, but the major categories are really what you need to know for this course. So the Heinz dilemma. Heinz has a wife, she's very ill, there's one medicine that will save her. There's a pharmacist who will not lower the price of the drug. What should Heinz do? He's asked everyone for money and no one can help him. So if it were pre-conventional, moral judgments are selfish. The individual is trying to avoid punishment. A pre-conventional child would sit there and say, Heinz should never steal the drugs, ever. And you could sit there and say, but his wife will die. Yeah, but Heinz should never steal the drugs. And that's very pre-conventional, because if Heinz stole the drugs, Heinz would get punished. And if you get punished, you are bad. Conventional morality is a little bit more advanced, and the judgments consider other people, rules, convention, duty, and laws. So this is that you can break the rules, but you should still be held accountable for them. So in the Heinz dilemma, Heinz should steal the drugs, but he should also go to jail. And so there's this idea of, little kids at this age, if you think about you don't cut lines, and it's all about kind of the rules, the laws. You do consider other people, but it's very much about kind of the hard and fast rule systems that we have. Post-conventional, which is what Kohlberg would argue that many of us don't get to, is that moral judgments are based off of personal standards and universal principles of justice. These universal principles of justice is really kind of the big thing. The idea that in the Heinz dilemma, Heinz is doing the right thing by stealing the drug, and that he shouldn't have to go to jail for doing that, because the idea that someone was trying to make money off of another person's life is actually evil and wrong, and that stealing the drug was the right thing to do, and that he did nothing wrong in that. That would be considered post-conventional. And there are 2 levels of post-conventional, with the last one being a higher ethical principle. That's the part that most of us don't get to. Most of us get to kind of level 5, the very first stage of post-conventional. Just again, another way of looking at this, again, with pre-conventional, right and wrong is determined by rewards and punishments. So punishment or obedience, whatever leads to punishment is wrong. Then it's followed up with whatever is rewarded, that is the right way to behave. So if you're in a dressing room and a child finds a wallet, okay? The child, if it returns the wallet to, say, the owner of the store, if the child does that because they're anticipating a reward, because they want to be rewarded, they're pre-conventional. But if the child returns it because it's the right thing to do and everyone will see them as a good person, then that's good intentions, the good behavior. Or if they're doing it because it's against the law to keep things that don't belong to you, that's still conventional. Now, when we get into the abstract notions of justice, that one is, again, where, rules can sometimes be broken, that there's some flexibility, all of that. So again, I don't know if that last example is going to flow into this, but this one is where you really kind of think of things on a much higher, more kind of moral basis, and rules become kind of secondary to what is most moral. There's pretty heavy critics with Kohlberg's research. One, that he used all male subjects. 2, that they all came from the exact same socioeconomic background in the exact same city. People in collectivist cultures define things morally different than individualistic. They look at the importance to the group. Carol Gillian argued that the moral ideal for women was not this justice orientation, but that maybe it was more of what she called a care orientation, that women care more about how the group would function or how the group would feel, and less about justice principles. The big thing with the critics between Kohlberg and with Gilligan, who was his biggest critic, is that the truth actually kind of lies in between both of them. Men aren't only justice orientation, right and wrong based off of rules, and women aren't always care orientation. In fact, there's a bit of both in men and women. Moral reasoning matters. So when we look at it, we can't just sit there and say that because Kohlberg did what we'd call androcentric research, we can't just sit there and say that his research doesn't matter. What we do know from it is that how you morally reason something can really be a pretty good predictor of your behavior. However, moral reasoning is not the same as moral behavior. So people with pre-conventional moral reasoning, it only matters if I get caught, are more likely to commit crimes. When looking at moral action is doing the right thing. People who engage in moral action are usually more empathetic and they are better at self-discipline. When we look at moral education, we actually have to focus not just on action but also attitude. And what we can find is that someone may actually have a moral attitude towards something but have behaviors that contradict that, mostly because of the people who are around them. So you may have a teen who smokes because their friends do, but they still think that smoking is bad. Their moral attitude is that it's unhealthy and it's bad for them, but the social influence of the people around them encourage them to engage in that behavior. Then we get into Erikson, and Erikson looks at psychosocial stages. When we get into personality, we'll talk about Freud and psychosexual stages. Erikson is a student of Freud. He is what we'd call a neo-Freudian. However, he was more interested in the social engagement of children and people as they grow and how that changes the way that they emerge throughout their life, not just focusing on the sex, which is what was really kind of the primary focus of Freud. He believes that it was 8 stages and that at every stage there is a conflict and you either are successful or you're not. If you are not successful in that stage, that at some point in your life you will have to revisit and overcome whatever the conflict was. This is just a really quick chart. Pause here if you want to study it. Stage 1 is trust versus mistrust. So you look at who is in the social environment of the child. That's going to be their primary caregivers. If the primary caregivers are responsive caregivers, the child will see the world as a trusting place. If the primary caregivers are inadequate, unpredictable, cold, indifferent, if they're rejecting, if they're abusive, if they're negligent, then the child will not trust the world. You need to not only know trust versus mistrust, but you need to know the age range. So this is birth to 1. Stage 2 is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So this is when children are going from 1 to 3 and they're starting to do things for themselves. Walk upstairs, use the potty, feed themselves. If they are given the opportunity, even with a guiding hand, to do things for themselves, they're going to develop autonomy. So no one lets a child just walk up the stairs by themselves when they're learning to walk. But in that first picture, you see grandma or mom or whomever holding the baby's hands and being there as a safe sense of support. And on the next page, you see the kid going up the stairs on their own, but obviously with mom or dad probably a couple of stairs behind them, making sure that if they were to fall, they wouldn't fall all the way. If you have the overprotective or the ridiculing parent, that can make the child feel like they should be doubtful in their actions and feel shameful about them as well. They may stop trying. At stage 3, about from 3 to 5, you have initiative versus guilt. So the child is going to continue. They're going to have better language skills. They're going to try to initiate. So they're going to try to initiate friendships. They're going to try to initiate the use of imagination. They're going to start to play the why game. They're going to ask those questions. Parents will make the child feel like they should continue to initiate these things if they pay attention, if they give positive feedback. However, the opposite can happen. If the parents become highly critical, if they try to stop the child from playing, or if they discourage their questions, the child may just stop initiating these things and instead feel guilty for trying. Stage 4 is what we'll call industry versus inferiority, and this is from 6 to 12. What you should notice at this point is that from 6 to 12, the child is now in school. So industry is when the child is praised for productive activities, but this is going to be the first time that the child is actually going to be assessed in relation to its peers. So it's going to get an A or a B or a C or a D on a paper, not because of who they are, but because of the product that they create. So they're actually creating a product and being measured off of it. If, however, the child feels that everything is inadequate or messy or not good enough, they may start to feel inferior and they may start to decline in the production of what they make. So this is my daughter in kindergarten, and it was a letter to her dad about her tooth fairy experience. And it says, "Dear Daddy, I have a wiggle tooth in my mouth. If I lose a tooth, the tooth fairy will come. Love, Mia." Now, this is obviously riddled with all sorts of spelling mistakes, and it's just bad writing. But she was 5 or 6, and it was her effort. And so we praised her for her industry. And so she would write all the time, and both of my kids still write all the time. It's because we told them how wonderful it was, and they've improved and they continue to improve. So this is that idea that if we had sat down and tried to correct her or tried to make her redo this correctly, it may have actually made her feel more like she was being punished, and she may have stopped wanting to write. Stage 5 is where you guys are at. It's called identity versus role confusion. I'm not saying that you guys are all confused, but right now you guys are at a point where you're trying to figure out the question of who am I? So this is where you start to figure out, and we say put on different hats. This is where you start to figure out your political ideologies, your moral ideologies, whether or not you want to have a family or not have a family, or go to college or not have to go. This is where you're doing your future planning. You're just trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And what do you want separate from your parents? During this stage, you will either get to know who you are, or you may actually experience role confusion, where you're unsure of who you are and you kind of try to figure it out, but there's a couple of different end results for this one, and we'll talk about that in a little bit with a different researcher called James Marcia. When we say adolescence, this entire idea of identity versus role confusion, the identity part may not actually come until the end of adolescence. And remember, adolescence doesn't end when you're 18 and the law says that you are now officially adult. Adolescence might not end for you until like 22, 23, 24. So when we get to stage 6, young adulthood, this is once you've figured out you. Hopefully you have. And that's intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy is when you are able to actually learn to form a true caring relationship with another person. You can only do this once you know who you are. So many of you probably feel like you're there right now, but most of us would argue that it's not until you actually have the safety nets removed that you really figure out who you are. And so with that being said, you may find that when we look at intimacy versus isolation, once you know you can actually be you with another person. Erickson argues that at this point, if someone doesn't try to connect with others, they may feel alone and uncared for the duration of their life. Stage 7 is middle adulthood. And this is going to not just be your 20s or your 30s, because that's not middle adulthood. Middle adulthood is like your 40s and your 50s. And this is when we would have what we'd call a midlife readjustment. It used to be called a midlife crisis. Those don't really exist. And you're interested in guiding the next generation. You want to see what you can do to improve the world. And often that next generation is also your own children. Or you can stagnate. You stay concerned with just your own needs and your own comforts, and never looking outward towards others. The last one is stage 8, and that's going to be late adulthood. And really with this one, late adulthood keeps getting pressed a little bit later. But this is when you start looking back on your life and you feel that you had a life filled with integrity, that you had self-respect and you had people that you definitely felt connected to, and that you did things that make you feel that you have a sense of respectability. Or you can have despair. And that means that you have a lifetime of regret or heartache and remorse. The really sad thing about Erickson's 8 stages is that when you get to stage 8, this last kind of stage, he says this is really the only one that you don't have a whole lot of time to correct. So we get back to identity versus intimacy, and we kind of had those fairly well laid out for us by Erickson, but identity is your sense of self, and intimacy is your ability to form a close, loving relationship. And again, most people would argue you have to know who you are before you can truly be intimate emotionally with somebody. Marcia has 4 identity statuses. And while he is not with Erickson, he says that, in the adolescent age, this is what adolescents are trying to identify with and figure out. And there's 4 of them. The first one is identity achievement. And so this is when the student, the child, the adolescent, has gone through a crisis period. They have decided upon an occupation or an ideology, a life that they want to live, and they are going to do it whether their decision is going to conflict with their parents' wishes. They are themselves, they have made their choice, they know who they want to be. There's identity diffusion. They lack a commitment, so they don't really know what they want to be. They haven't really experienced a crisis, this decision-making point, and they're uninterested in things that are ideological, so they just try a little bit of everything. This might be someone who goes to college because their parents said you need to go to college, and when they get there they really don't know what direction they want to take their life, so They don't know what career to go into, so they really just take classes in everything with no real focus. They're starting to diffuse. They go with the flow. They do what other people are doing just because they're trying to figure things out. So we'll talk about the other two, moratorium and foreclosure. But again, when we look at that, achievement and foreclosed, those will lead to commitment. Moratorium and diffused, there's really no commitment. They're more kind of floating around. Achieved and moratorium, you're going to see some crises, where foreclosure and diffused, no crises. Honestly, don't worry too much about this slide. Just kind of know where they go and which ones are going to lead you to a commitment versus no commitment. So, moratorium. This one, again, not so great. Adolescents are still in a crisis period. They're unable to make a commitment, so they compromise among the parental wishes, society demands, and their own capabilities. In other words, when we're looking at this one, they're going to still have a hard time with commitment because they're going to be trying to take on everybody's ideas. Foreclosure, even though there's going to be a commitment, it's not their own commitment. And this one, while you have commitment in it, it's not a healthy one. In this one with foreclosure, the parental goals and their own, they're blurred. That line is not really clear. And so they, when threatened with any decision, they just resort back to what their parents' values are, to what their parents want, and that would be foreclosure. So while a commitment is made, they've decided what they want to be, it might be more their parents' decision than their own. So when we look at adolescence and identity status, moratorium and achievement, really more self-direction. Diffusion and foreclosure, definitely more dependence. Ideally, what you want to have is identity achievement. You want to be able to kind of decide for yourself and know exactly what you want to do. Foreclosure, arguably probably the least good of them, and that is because with foreclosure, you are having someone else kind of drive your life. So with Marcia, identity achievement is correlated with higher self-esteem. In other words, when you know who you want to be, you can feel good about what you're doing to get there. Adolescents can go through all four of those identity statuses. You're not locked into one. And identity achievement most often extends into young adulthood. So knowing what you want to be the minute you walk into college may not be what you walk out of college actually being. And your first career, you may get into the job that you thought you wanted for the rest of your life, and you might hate it. It's okay. It's all just figuring things out, and eventually you'll settle into what works. With all of this, there will be a change to the parent-child relationship. As you get older, your positive, warm interactions with your parents should decrease. Now, just kind of think about it this way. If a 2 to a 4-year-old comes up to mom or dad and shows them a picture, your parents should be elated, and they should hug you and kiss you and put you on their lap and all sorts of lovely kind of warm and engaging activities. If they're doing that to an 11-year-old, the 11-year-old's probably annoyed and probably kind of bothered by this kind of over babying and gushing. And if you get to 16 or 17, that's definitely not how you want to be treated. So it's not that the love is absent, it's just that the kind of overly gushy, lovey, huggy, kissy, kind of intense behaviors decrease. And that's necessary. You need to be able to kind of start to slowly separate yourself as an individual from your parent. Emerging adulthood is this kind of new stage that we've discussed. Now, Erickson doesn't really have it. Adolescence for him goes into early adulthood, but emerging adulthood, 18 to 25, and during this time, you're probably in this weird adult yet not fully adult kind of situation. So adults marry in their mid-20s. The closer you are to major developed cities, that age actually gets a little bit older. That means that the start of families is a little bit older. You're going to probably, for the most part in our culture, be in college or in some form of higher education for a couple of years after high school. So really, you're not fully independent probably until your mid-20s. That should be it for adolescence. We'll get you another video on adulthood.